I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and it's a real pleasure not only to welcome you to this symposium on the life and work of Yud Lamed Peretz, but to host this symposium itself. Yud Lamed Peretz was at the foundation of modern Jewish life. He was one of the principal figures in the process that eventually gave birth to the YIVO Institute. And I will not say more about him except that I do want to mention one comment from his memoir that always struck me as of signal importance and in more than just the subject of Yiddish literature. At a certain point as a boy, Peretz was recognized as a prodigy, and the head of the library, or the librarian of the local library, recognizes this and gives him the key to the library and says to him he can go whenever he likes to read whatever he wants in the public library. And there he finds books in Polish and in French and in German and in many other languages, many of which he can't read. But he works diligently. He reads all the books he possibly can in natural science and in philosophy and in literature and travel. And he understands that there is a much larger world than one that he ever conceived of as a boy in the relatively sealed Jewish community. And then he says one very important thing, reflecting about his reading. He says, "I couldn't express these things in Yiddish because I had no words for these ideas in Yiddish. I couldn't even talk about them with myself when I tried." And so Peretz's contribution is not only that he developed literary Yiddish and raised it to a literary level and created, or was one of those who helped to create literary Yiddish. He was also responsible for something deeper than that, which is developing new pathways between language and thinking, between the thinking process within the Jewish world and that of the larger world outside. And this is something for which we are all in his debt and in the debt of all of the founders of Yiddish literature, modern Yiddish literature today. Before we get on with our distinguished panel, I want to say a couple of words about the YIVO Institute. I hope all of you saw the brochure that's on the table outside for the project, which we call the Vilna Collections, a project to digitize all of our pre-war collections. These are collections that YIVO had in its library and in its archive until 1941, when the Nazis came. The Nazis ripped the archive apart. A lot of the material was sent to Frankfurt, Germany, where it was discovered after the war. Some of it, through the efforts, the heroic efforts of Avram Sutzkever and Shmerki Kaczerginski, were hidden in the Vilna ghetto and given to non-Jewish friends, and some of it was lost. And for the first time since 1941, these materials are being knit back together by this Vilna project, which is currently underway both here in New York and also in Vilnius, Lithuania. We are processing the materials. We are cleaning the materials. Some of these materials have lain rolled up in balls since 1941 in canvas sacks that were discovered in the basement of St. George Church in Vilnius in 1989 and 91. We are cleaning these materials, preserving them and digitizing them. And just to give you some idea of how important this project is, when I went first to Vilnius and I opened one of these boxes of unprocessed materials, I took out one that was rolled into a ball like my fist, and I unrolled it and put it on the table, and literally the dust of the Vilna ghetto fell out into my hand. And so this is not just a scholarly project. This is a project of immensely important cultural and, I would say, spiritual reclamation of finally putting pieces back together and putting things back where they belong. We've found that among the documents that we have here in New York, the second half of the document is still in a box in Vilnius. And by virtue of digitizing them, we're going to be able to reunite them. It's a very big project. It's over 1.5 million documents, hundreds of thousands of pages of books. It's a very expensive project, and it will take about 7 years to complete. And any of you who wishes to help support this project would be invited. I invite you all to find out more about it by picking up a brochure in the back. Today's symposium, Hope and Fear, Yud Lamed Peretz and the Forging of Modern Jewish Culture, will have as our keynote speaker Michael Steinlauf, as well as speakers Jeremy Dauber, Ken Frieden, and Martin Peretz. Following the last lecture, our speakers will come together on stage for a moderated discussion and explore themes over the course of the program. Unfortunately, Professor Steinlauf had a moderate stroke a few weeks ago and is currently recovering in Philadelphia. He's making great progress, as he tells us, which we're delighted to hear, but because of this, we have had to arrange this Skype connection. And unfortunately, with the Skype connection, the audio has failed, the video has failed us, so he will read his talk and you'll hear what he has to say. But we're very grateful that he is able to be with us and to participate. In the unlikely event that Skype fails even further and we can't reconnect, Ken Frieden will step in and read the rest of Michael's talk, and we'll try to reconnect with Michael later in the program. I want to encourage everyone to become a member of YIVO, to find out more about us. We have in our archives many, many documents pertaining to Yud Lamed Peretz, but alas, we do not have the archive of Yud Lamed Peretz. One of the documents that we just recently found as a result of this Vilna digitization process is a letter from Helena Peretz to Max Weinreich, in which she donates the Yud Lamed Peretz archive. But it appears that it was lost during the war, and all we have today are letters. We have a couple of manuscripts. We have a variety of materials that I hope a little bit later in this fall we'll be able to put on exhibit. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Michael Steinlauf, who is Professor of History and Director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Gratz College in Philadelphia. He is the author of Bondage to the Dead, Poland and the Memory of the Holocaust, and contributing editor to the YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe. His writings have been translated into Hebrew, Polish, German, and Italian. Steinlauf is also active in various kinds of Jewish memory work in Poland and has served as chief historical advisor and curator of modern Jewish culture for the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. which recently opened in Warsaw. He is currently at work on a study of the Yiddish writer and activist Yud Lamed Peretz. So, Helena, how do we get... Michael, are you there?
I'm there. Can you hear me?
Very good.
Am I being...
Let's begin.
Yeah, well, it's an extraordinary honor to be giving this talk on the occasion of Yud Lamed Peretz's 100th Yortzeit. And at YIVO, an institution founded to represent everything that Peretz stood for. So I'm humbled, and I'll do my best to fulfill this responsibility. Let me begin by comparing two epitaphs, Sholem Aleicham's and Yud Lamed Peretz's. Sholem Aleichem wrote his own in 1905. It's inscribed on his tombstone, which is located in the Workman's Circle section of the Mount Carmel Cemetery in Queens. Do liegt a Yid a Posheter, geschrieben Yiddish Teich für Weiber, und fahren Prostenvolk hat given a Humorist, a Schreiber. Here lies a simple Jew, wrote in Yiddish for women. And for simple folk, he was a humorist, a writer. Das ganze Leben ausgelacht, geschlagen mit der Welt Kapores. Die ganze Welt hat gut gemacht, und oi weh, gewen auf Zores. He laughed at all of life, told the world where to get off, made the whole world feel good, but he, oh dear, had troubles. Und darf gedemmt, wenn der Eulam hat gelacht, geklatscht und pflegt sich freien, hat gekränkt, das weiß nur Gott, besod, as keiner so nicht sehen. And just in fact, when the audience laughed and clapped and had a fine time, he'd get ill, as God only knows, secretly, so no one should see. Peretz's epitaph is inscribed on the inside of the cupola of the elaborate mausoleum erected in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery on the 10th anniversary of his death. The words of the epitaph were taken from Peretz's play, The Golden Agate, The Golden Chain, about 4 generations of a Hasidic family. In Act 1, as his terrified Hasidim look on, the patriarch, Reb Shloime, at his tish, at his ritual table, refuses to perform Havdalah, the ceremony marking the return of normal time after the Sabbath. Reb Shloime, in other words, attempts to force redemption, thereby risking the destruction of the world. In the final act, Shloime's descendant Yonason is left doubting his power to lead, to maintain the golden chain unbroken. But it's the words of Reb Shloime that were inscribed on Peretz's oil. Azoi gehen mir, singendig und tanzendig, mir große Jiden, Shabbos Yontev dicke Jiden, die Neshomes flackern, vor uns Wolken spalten sich, Himmeln prallen die Teuren auf, in onen Hakovet schwimmen wir rein, zum Kisse Hakovet zu. So we go, singing and dancing, we big Jews, Shabbos holiday Jews. Our souls blaze, clouds part before us. The heavens burst their gates. Into the cloud of glory we swim, right up to the throne of glory. Und mir betten nicht, und mir betteln nicht. Größe, stolze Jiden sind in mir. Wir sagen ihm, länger warten nicht gekonnt. Shir Hashirim singen mir, singendig, tanzendig, gehen wir. And we don't ask, and we don't beg. Big, proud Jews are we. We tell him, couldn't wait any longer. We sing the song of songs, singing, dancing, we go. The ironies are extraordinary. Sholem Aleichem, the self-described Klein Menschele, little man, who liked to make people laugh, rests in an out-of-the-way corner of New York. But his creation, Tevye, has permanently rooted himself in Jewish and world culture. Peretz, called the father of modern Yiddish culture, the supremely public man who situated himself at the prophetic center of that culture, Peretz, whose stature in the Yiddish-speaking world a century ago could not be exaggerated, lies under a crumbling monument in the vast, ruined Warsaw Jewish cemetery. Today, Peretz has been nearly completely forgotten. Sholem Aleichem was an extraordinary literary figure. Peretz was that and more. As millions of small-town Jews streamed into Polish cities at the end of the 19th century, Peretz oversaw the creation of a culture that spoke to their needs and in turn created those needs. From his apartment in Warsaw for a quarter of a century, Peretz produced a stream of poetry, stories, and plays, as well as critical and polemical essays published in his own journals and in the daily Yiddish press. This literature scrutinized every new cultural and political development on the Jewish and the Polish street. Peretz was the first to bring high literary talent into the service of the workers' movement, the first to turn to Jewish folklore as a source for literary creation, the first critic in the history of the emerging Yiddish theater, the first to bring a modernist aesthetic to the Yiddish stage, the first Jewish literary figure to involve himself in electoral politics. His apartment at the legendary address Tseglana 1 was a magnet for young Jewish writers and artists from throughout Eastern Europe. They came to him for approval of their first Yiddish writings, and they gathered at his home on Friday and Saturday nights to sing the folk songs they had collected in the small towns of Eastern Europe, just as Hasidim gathered around their masters to sing their holy tunes. In a time of vast transition, Peretz dedicated his life to finding paths along which Jews could emerge as Jews in the modern age. On Peretz's 100th Yortzeit, let's see what Peretz was about in his own time and what we can retrieve of his legacy today. Peretz cannot be separated from his ideas. His literary work and his evolving political and cultural views were intimately interwoven. The great Yiddish literary critic Shmuel Niger declared that Peretz's literary work, his belletristic, and his political and cultural writings, his publicistic, were of one piece, each shot through with the other. If I weren't afraid that I'd be misunderstood, he wrote, I would say that Peretz was always an essayist, a publicist in the higher sense of the word. Even when he wrote poetry, folk-like tales, Hasidic stories, and dramas. He was a thinker with a great belletristic talent, a publicist with an artistic imagination. Niger was afraid he'd be misunderstood because of our modern assumption that art is cheapened when it conveys a message. But Peretz himself was unafraid of saying just this about his work. I declare openly that I am a tendentious writer, he announced near the end of his life. I create the scenes only in order to illustrate a particular idea. And Peretz did not hesitate to leap beyond writing into the political and cultural struggles of his time. Let's have a look at Peretz's ideas. Peretz arrived at his major ideas gradually, from an early allegiance to the Jewish Enlightenment movement, known as Haskalah, then to the Jewish Socialist movement, especially the Bund, with a brief nod to Zionism. By the early years of the 20th century, he had arrived at a version of diaspora nationalism. This was a notion that Jews, above all in Eastern Europe, could be seen as a nationality, that their homeland was wherever they lived in large and compact communities. This idea had become increasingly popular towards the end of the 19th century. It developed in a world where numerous other groups were using the discourse of nationality to define themselves, although for the non-Jewish groups, the homeland tended to be geographically contiguous. The principles of Jewish diaspora nationalism were first formulated by the historian Shimon Dubnoff in a series of articles in 1897. This happened to be the year of the first Zionist Congress in Basel and the founding of the Bund in Vilna. Dubnoff's historical writings had focused on the importance of Jewish communal organizations, kehillas, chevras, in pre-modern Jewish life, on their ability to facilitate a high degree of communal autonomy for centuries within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Jews were de facto a nationality, Dubnoff now declared, and he developed the political consequences of this idea under the conditions of modernity. He argued that Jews needed to strengthen the internal structure of their communal institutions, which had been weakened after a century of rule by tsars and kaisers, even as they fought for representation within a future multinational state. For Peretz, it was the cultural imperatives of diaspora nationalism that were central. Above all, the commitment to Yiddish as the unifying feature of Jewish peoplehood. Nevertheless, in the course of the turbulent first decades of the 20th century, Peretz found himself drawn into a host of political struggles. The first of these came amidst the revolution of 1905, when Peretz, then in his early 50s, reached the peak of his influence. On January 22nd, 1905, in St. Petersburg, a demonstration of over 100,000 workers and their families was set upon by the police. This event, which became known as Bloody Sunday, triggered escalating protests throughout the empire that climaxed in a general strike in October. On the 30th of the month, Nicholas II issued the so-called October Manifesto that granted civil liberties and established a representative parliament. The Duma, thereby turning the empire into something approximating a constitutional monarchy. The manifesto was a great victory for liberal forces, but over the next several weeks, as revolutionaries organized a Soviet in St. Petersburg and an armed uprising in Moscow, the counter-revolutionary right, represented by the so-called Black Hundreds, fomented a wave of violence which included the worst pogroms in Russian history. In the 3 months following the manifesto, over 3,000 Jews were murdered and tens of thousands injured in over 600 pogroms. With few exceptions, the police and army stood by or occasionally participated in the violence. Simultaneously, the government declared martial law. Over the following months and years, much of what had been promised in the manifesto was gradually undermined. Nevertheless, the revolution brought 2 lasting victories for the Jews. The government had long refused to permit a periodical press in Yiddish, and for several decades it had banned the performance of Yiddish theater. Now both prohibitions were lifted. The stream of Yiddish dailies, weeklies, and monthlies that followed, along with the explosion of Yiddish theater, first in Warsaw, then throughout the other towns and cities of the Russian Empire, led quickly to the flowering of a mass Jewish culture. Hundreds of thousands of Jews became theater goers and newspaper readers nearly overnight. Traditional and secular, rich and poor, newspaper readers and theater goers began to constitute a new kind of community. They found it increasingly natural to think of themselves using the discourse of modern nationality as das Jiddische Volk, the Jewish people or nation. Peretz, as I've mentioned, had worked with the early workers' movement and briefly with the Zionists. But in 1905, for the first time, the ideologies of nationalism and socialism, primarily confined previously to drawing rooms and garrets, with an occasional strike thrown in, swept up great numbers of ordinary people, both Jews and non-Jews. Today, a century later, knowing what would come of all this for good and for evil, it is an effort to imagine days when, amidst the violence, anything seemed possible, above all, the dreams of the new ideologues, when, to paraphrase Peretz, men felt they could be eagles. To put it another way, Reb Shloime's Tish was now in the streets. Peretz leaped into the new era, using every means, every genre at his disposal to engage the new potentials. Peretz became literary editor of the new Warsaw Yiddish daily, Der Weg, The Way, where he published in the course of 9 months some 50 texts. These writings span the entire range of his creativity. There are stories and one-act plays, poetry in verse and in prose, translations, literary and theater criticism, as well as publicistic of all kinds. Hisgeilis, oder die Meise von Ziegenbock, Revelation, or the story of the billy goat, is a story that Peretz chose to publish in the first issue of Der Weg. It's a tale within a tale, told by the tzaddik Reb Nachmanke as a way of explaining his sadness. It concerns a billy goat with magical horns that each night secretly extend to heaven for news of the coming of Messiah. During hard times, the billy goat pulls gems out of heaven and hurls them into the marketplace to provide a livelihood for the townsfolk. But struck by the beauty of his horns, Jews begin to approach the billy goat for pieces from which to make snuff boxes, and gradually his access to heaven is lost. Critics have read the story as a parable of the artist who sacrifices himself for the sake of his audience. There's certainly something to that reading, but there's also something else to which we will return. There's great foreboding throughout Peretz's writings at this time. Wandering through streets filled with demonstrators of every persuasion, resounding with frequent cries of jedność, unity, Peretz cannot muster the trust to believe in it all. A new day, you say. You believe, but I don't. Do you have the right to demand faith from me? His disquiet emerges full-blown in his poetry. Don't go with me, true and golden child. Sad is the lonely wanderer's road, is the refrain of a prose poem published before Rosh Hashanah, a month before the October Manifesto. The wanderer's road leads him through horrors, nights filled with lost souls seeking redemption and wrathful fallen angels, days when, quote, through the ash of those burnt up, through the dust of those never brought to their graves, an angry red sun glares, unquote. This is not the only place where Peretz's visions seem premonitions of the Holocaust. Yet he begs forgiveness of the child for what he has planted in its heart. In the following days, der Weg, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, appears another poem about innocence and experience, this time a dialogue. A young woman solicits New Year's wishes from an older person. He at first demurs, explaining that he can scarcely imagine her future. When she insists, he responds with 3 wishes. The first is that she tell a smith to make crowbars and hammers instead of plowshares, because there are so many gates to smash. The second is that she no longer play with the sea, but wrestle with it as with a lion. The third is that she learn to dance among swords. Terrified, the young woman recoils, whereupon she is offered a lighter wish, that she love the morning, the radiance of the new day. Lay to rest the sweet poison of the dying evening, and live for tomorrow when new life awakens. It will carry you away, child. The speaker concludes ambiguously, is this also beyond your strength? 2 poems in 2 days, one fearing action and the other counseling action. Should it surprise us that shortly after, Peretz chose to publish a bit of Ecclesiastes in Yiddish translation? Hevel Havolim, vanity of vanities, sounds like this in Peretz's Yiddish. Narisch, narisch, als ist narisch, men wird die Welt von Fleck nicht rühren, siehst das als, was ist geschehen, wie das, was wird einmal passieren. Foolish, foolish, all is foolish. One will not move the world from stain. In vain all that has occurred, as that which will still happen. Doubting his own strength and the very value of acting, Peretz nevertheless stepped fully into the political. Published in early January 1906, at a meeting, chronicles his venture onto the dangerous evening streets and to a socialist gathering. The piece is signed Lucifer, one of Peretz's scoffing alter egos. He listens to a speaker invoke a litany of capitalist crimes and dubs it the Teucheche, the chapter of curses from the Bible. When the speaker concludes, but now your day has arrived, you will be the judges, and you will judge measure for measure, Peretz responds, it sounds like the trumpets over the walls of Jericho. And he asks, is the day really so near? Moscow is quiet now, he reflects. The barricades are smashed. The guilty and innocent blood is covered with clean, innocent snow. In a word, though some may be unaware of it as yet, the revolution is waning. Does the audience believe the speaker? Peretz wonders. Walking home, he edges past a drunken Cossack by offering him a cigarette. 10 days later, abandoning the persona of Lucifer, Peretz addressed the workers' movement directly. Amidst the flux of counter-revolutionary violence, liberal hopes, and declining revolutionary prospects, Peretz embraces the workers' movement and simultaneously challenges it. The result is an extraordinary text entitled Hoffnung und Schreck, Hope and Fear. My heart is with you, he begins. My eye can't have its fill of your flaming banner. My ear doesn't tire of your mighty song. Man should eat his fill and have light, and he should be free and able to shape his own life and labor. When you march on old Sodom to tear it down, my soul goes with you, and the certainty that you must triumph fills and warms and intoxicates me like old wine. And yet, I fear you. I fear the oppressed who triumph. They can themselves become oppressors. Do they not say among you that humanity must march like an army and that you will play the tune along the way? But humanity is not an army. The strong go in front. The more passionate feel more deeply. The proud grow taller. Will you not spread your wings over mediocrity? Will you not armor indifference and protect the gray, identically shorn herd? As victors, you can become the bureaucracy. You will be preoccupied with regulating how strongly and how often the human pulse may beat, how far the human eye may see, how much the ear may take in, and what dreams the longing heart may dream. There will be no empty stomachs, but souls will hunger. And the eagle, the human spirit, will stand with clipped wings by the trough beside the cow and the ox. Justice will abandon you, and you will not notice it. And you will build prisons for those who point to the abyss into which you are sinking. I hope for your victory, but I fear and I tremble for your victory. You are my hope, you are my fear. No other of Peretz's writings, to my knowledge, better deserves to be called prophetic. In the weeks after this reckoning with revolutionary socialism, Peretz published a series of 3 articles entitled Heimische Sachen. These texts are an attempt to formulate his own credo. The expression Heimische Sachen means both domestic things and things that are snug, cozy, and warm. The latter meaning here is entirely ironic. The first article begins with a vision of the end of days in which God judges the nations in the valley of Yehoshaphat. Among the nations stand the Jews, the only people without its own soul, and as God, not much of a body either. The Jews are divided into classes, though it's difficult to distinguish among them, and into parties, which are only identifiable by their banners. Standing on the side are groups of nervous Übermenschen, supermen, those who might be leaders, to each of whom God asks, What have you done for the soul of your people? Each group confesses it had no time to spin the soul of our people. And each receives an appropriate punishment. Revolutionaries, for example, who are caught up in red flaming days, in seconds that flew asunder like lightning, are turned into fireflies that die each day with the setting sun. Pampered, well-educated young ladies who raced from one lecture or meeting to another are turned into a swarm of butterflies. The second article is a manifesto of diaspora nationalism, unique in Peretz's writings. Addressed to socialists, it weaves their own language with that of biblical prophecy. My people has been chosen for shame and derision, for wounds and woe, for blows and pain. The reddest of banners has been thrust into his hand with the cry, "Go further and further with all liberators, all fighters for the future, all the destroyers of Sodom. But you will not rest with them. The earth will burn under your feet. As long as blood is spilled, a desire suppressed, a wing clipped, it will be your wing, your desire, your blood. You will be the very last to be freed when man is freed from the earth, when out of human worms, human eagles rise. Don't pride yourself on your red banner. It is just the weak reflection of the bloody banner in the hand of the chosen people. I go with my people. The glint of its banner ignites my soul, and I call, Jews of all lands and peoples, unite. Long and perilous is the road. Hold together. The last article plunges us back into the fallen world. It's subtitled Tandet, a word that denotes cheap, shoddy goods. And it speaks in the name of the Jewish masses. What is the world? An antechamber to the next one. Here one passes through, there one remains. To work here, to love here, to think of tomorrow and the day after here. Let millionaires build marble mausoleums to themselves. For us poor, a flimsy headboard is enough. And one lives just to get by. Abi weiter. Just to survive. Überzukommen. On the eve of a holiday, one sighs. The holiday's over already. Childhood is a prelude to marriage, and on the wedding day the groom dons a shroud. Bride and groom fast and confess their sins. 2 little flowers of exile. 2 little Golis Blimlach sprout in the Jewish heart. Abi weiter, abi überkommen. Tandet. Everything is tandet. Life, trade, work. Without love, without certainty, without today and later, trembling shadows, trembling and clutching. Piety and good deeds, party activism, politics, half a flicker, a quarter flicker, a wisp, a thread. The community of Israel sits and patches and darns. The old chosen ones, the few dead fossilized cedars of Lebanon, look down on our little grasses and sigh. These are our grandchildren. We are rather far from Reb Shloimeh. And we are also far from any of the many attempts during Peretz's lifetime and after to distill a simple message from his writings. What, at least at this moment, is Peretz's countervision, his response to the creeds that surround him. Both socialism and Zionism posited a movement that was fully redemptive. One could aspire to a post-revolutionary world, classless and just, or to a so-called normal life lived in one's ancestral land. One way or another, the future would not resemble the present. It would differ from it absolutely. What was the guarantee? Some combination of human will and historical necessity. But also something else, working underneath this human time and its possibilities, or perhaps beyond it. It was redemptive time that guaranteed the outcome of human struggles. It would take extraordinary sacrifices. The individual might not live to see it. It could take generations, but it would come to pass. Despite the impassioned denials of its champions, there was a touch of something beyond the human in such thinking. But Peretz rejected these notions. He rejected all the guarantees. Summoned to believe, his belief falters even as he attempts it. His eyes cannot tire of the red banner, but the possibility of its triumph fills him with foreboding. It could turn into its opposite. And what sort of triumph would even the steadiest stream of Jewish settlers to the land of Israel entail? Could it possibly transform the situation of the Jewish masses in Eastern Europe or elsewhere in the world, for that matter? Peretz's vision, in contrast, is rooted in the everyday. The Bundist's favorite word was do, here, which produced the abstract noun doikate, here-ness, meaning one's energy was to be directed here, to the daily struggles of working people, and not there, not dort, towards some bourgeois Zionist dream. But Bundist, nevertheless, maintained a link to something that was just as dort in its own way as the Zionist dream, namely the promise of a just world. In contrast, Peretz's commitment to doikate was absolute. What was do? It was everyday Jews, Yidden von a ganz Jahr, in Golus, in exile. One dreams of leaping out of Golus, and sometimes one leaps. But when one leaped, there was no guarantee, either for the individual or the nation. One leaped in full awareness of the probable consequences, which are failure. And yet one leaped. One leaped because the alternative was tandet, spiritual death. Peretz was hardly the only diaspora nationalist. But more than Shimon Dubnow and even Shin Ansky, he seems to have grasped the tragic core of Golus. One can rise. One must rise. The expression oib nish checher, if not higher, the title of Peretz's celebrated story, just like the Golden Acate, escaped its context and became an exhortation to several generations of Yiddish-speaking Jews. Go higher than that. Aspire, create, liberate. One rises, and perhaps one is also pushed a bit or tugged by redemption. Like every generation that preceded us, reflected the philosopher Walter Benjamin in the 1930s, inching from Marx toward the God of history, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, unquote. But one pays the price. Golis exacts a toll. And here we can return to Reb Nachman's billy goat with its magical horns. The billy goat's horns stretch to heaven each night for news of Messiah. They also physically nourish an entire community. But the townspeople grow too familiar with the billy goat, and they love putting snuff into their noses. Because they love the tickle and the sneeze, the magical horns are gradually chopped into snuff boxes, into the detritus, the garbage of Golis. Redemption may be very near, but human beings need their snuff boxes. This story is how the holy Reb Nachman chooses to explain the cosmic sadness that has overcome him. In the years following the revolution, its gains proved flimsy. The left was driven back underground into factionalism and exile. Parliamentary politics, one of the chief promises of the newly granted constitution, was undermined by successive Tsarist decrees. Voting to the newly created Duma was increasingly weighted toward property owners and professionals. Factory workers were largely disenfranchised. Nevertheless, the new cultural initiatives unleashed by the revolution now became permanent features of Warsaw life. Peretz seized on the new opportunities. He worked tirelessly for the Yiddish press as contributor and editor. He helped create Yiddish schools, and he founded a key institution, the Musical Literary Society Hazomir, which attracted a generation of young Jews eager to become activists for Yiddish. By 1908, at the Chernovitz Conference, when Yiddish was declared a national language of the Jewish people, Peretz was ready to identify the Jewish nation with the speakers of Yiddish. One Jewish people, its language is Yiddish. And in this language we wish to gather our treasure, create our culture, further awake our soul, and unite culturally throughout all lands and in all times. But Peretz's doubts, though often veiled, were never far. Just months earlier, he published in a Vilna paper something called a letter, in which he addresses an anonymous figure who sees only roses, who avoids the mean streets, the hospital, and the slaughterhouse, who, Peretz concludes, has seen the sea, but not its storm, nor the broken ship on the sea. You are fortunate, but I don't envy you. Most importantly, it was precisely at this time that Peretz was working and reworking his magisterial modernist drama by Nacht auf den Alten Markt, Night at the Old Marketplace. Night at the Old Marketplace was never performed in Peretz's lifetime. Written in rhymed verse with 4 acts, a prologue, and a conclusion, a cast of several hundred, without a conventional plot, it was considered unstageable by the Yiddish theaters of the time. It is a challenging work even today. One way to approach the play is as a complex symphonic composition whose instruments are the many voices from the Jewish past and present over which soloists perform melodic lines. Among the soloists is the figure called the Wanderer, who first appears at the beginning of the play. In Hillel Halkin's marvelous translation, how much these ears have heard, and yet they would hear more. What's near still drives me on. What's far still draws me to it. The wanderer then falls asleep and dreams the play. The key soloist is the badchin, or wedding jester, who, with God asleep, he claims, attempts to bring the end of days and redemption. You can punish me tomorrow, but since you're sleeping now, I'm Generalissimo. But this is a darker attempt to bring redemption than Reb Shloime's. The jester exclaims, his beloved name's a sacred swindle. To be alive, you must believe and kill. So let me wish you happiness and health. Come, one and all, to the old marketplace to do my will. Once again, Peretz's words are prophetic. The 20th century will see monstrous attempts to create new worlds with God not asleep, but absent. The jester's megalomania anticipates Hitler and Stalin's, whose followers will also be instructed to believe and kill to do their master's will. The jester, however, still functions in the world of tradition, however attenuated. His megalomania would not necessitate the murder of millions. All he has to do is raise the dead. If he can keep them in the marketplace into the day after the cock crows, he will have succeeded. First, the half-dead from the veil of spirits appear in the marketplace. Then the dead from their graves in the cemetery march into the marketplace and occupy the synagogue. Even the statues on the church walls come alive. Into the marketplace come representatives of Jewish pain, the martyrs bewailing the meaning of their lives, and more, the regrets and sighs of those who lived lives unlived, unfulfilled. From the present appear figures such as workers, Zionists, cultured Jews, and the anonymous someone, the ideal mass man. I don't know who I am. I only know what I want. All this amidst snippets of folk tales, folk songs, folklore of all sorts, and from the synagogue, liturgy. Everything organized contrapuntally. Here's a simple example, an exchange between the jester and a figure called the recluse. 1, 2, God is through. 3, 4, he'll send no more. 5, 6, 7, miracles from heaven. 8, he shut his gate. Once they're assembled in the marketplace, the jester encourages the dead to dance. Feel what you've never let yourself feel. Live what you've never lived before. They dance, and the jester exults. Their dead faces almost look alive. There's desire, even lust in those dead eyes. They hop about with so much zeal. Their resurrection seems quite real. But suddenly, the morning star appears in the sky, and immediately after, the tin rooster on the roof of the synagogue crows. In the marketplace, the dead cringe as the jester asks for their help in wrestling the rooster. He invokes an ironic litany of messianic wannabes, past and present. Hey, what's happened to you all? You light spreaders and understanders, you messianic door bangers, you head against the wall bashers, you futuristic fly catchers. He then climbs the roof alone. If he bests the rooster, he will bring redemption, at least the traditional kind. But the jester emerges bloodied and beaten as the dead creep back to their graves. In his hand, he holds the wooden mallet used by the shamus, the beadle of the synagogue, each morning when he goes door to door waking Jews for morning prayer. As the curtain falls, the jester assumes this job and begins his rounds. Jews, go to shul. In Schulerein. But his call is drowned out by a factory whistle. The jester's call was assumed by many of Peretz's contemporaries to be Peretz's as well. He was widely and bitterly assailed for counseling Jews to go back to the old-time religion. 60 years later, Hona Shmeruk entitled his encyclopedic study of the play Peretz's Vision of Despair. But Peretz, I'd suggest, manages marvelously to slip past these certainties. In this case, there's the figure called the Wanderer, who has dreamt the entire play and awakens at its end. In an exchange with the recluse who asks, "Who but a fool could ever say that he has lived to see new things?" The Wanderer replies, "And in the heart's interior a secret hand is fashioning. New music's born, new hopes are spun. Oh, weave yourself, desire, weave." The wanderer will go on to dream and dream again. Night at the Old Marketplace may indeed be Peretz's ultimate judgment on the secular attempts of his and our time to redeem the world. But it is not a vision of absolute despair. With our feet firmly planted in the everyday, we may still dream and leap. For we have, after all, been endowed with that weak messianic power. There is, however, absolutely no guarantee of success, and we remain, finally, in Gaulis, in the funkiness of the everyday. I began this talk by citing the inscription on Peretz's oil, the words of the tzaddik Reb Shloimeh from the Golden Agate. I will close with Peretz's poem, Mein Muse, My Muse, written somewhat earlier. Nicht ken Nachtigall, mein Muse, hot ken Trellen, hot ken Siese, siz a Jidene, an Alte, an Eingeschrumpene, a Miese. Not a nightingale, my muse. She has no trills or sweetness. She's an old Jewess, shriveled and ugly. An Agune mit Jesäumim und Verspreite auf der Welt. Und an Eviente a Größe und sie schreit nur und sie schellt. An abandoned wife with orphans spread out across the world. A down-and-out pauper, and she only yells and curses. Peretz's legacy, I'd suggest, may be found in the tension between Reb Shloimeh and this muse. Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Jeremy Dauber, who is professor of Yiddish literature at Columbia University, where he also serves as director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and teaches in the American Studies program. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford, which he attended as Rhodes Scholar. His previous books include In the Demon's Bedroom, Yiddish Literature and Early Modern, and Antonio's Devils, Writers of the Jewish Enlightenment and Birth of Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature. He frequently lectures on topics relating to Jewish literature, history, humor, and popular culture. Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, Helena. Thank you to everyone at YIVO for allowing me to share, as Michael was saying, in the honor of being on the stage here to commemorate Peretz's 100th yard site. It is also a wonderful opportunity for me to address some intellectual debts to all of the members of this panel. To Michael, his work on memory, his passion for Jewish culture, and his perseverance in just being here, or being here, you'll get that on the video, under the circumstances. Ken Frieden's book on the dry classic, or on the three classic Yiddish writers, was one of the first things that I read when I set out on my path to learn about this literature, and it's remained a guiding point for me. But most of all, the debt to Marty Peretz, who I have known now for 20 years, who was my thesis advisor, my senior thesis advisor in college. And so for whom I am in great, great debt, and from whom I learned most powerfully and most relevantly to us that it was important to have a passion for ideas. It was important to have a passion for argument. It was important to know that ideas deeply mattered. And that is why he is going to be so disappointed when I don't argue with him today. That is to say, as you can see from from your pamphlets, I am talking about Peretz's Jewish comedy, and Marty has a talk on why Yud Lamed Peretz is not funny, and I'm sure you were expecting a great deal of fireworks, and who knows what we'll have, but I don't think so, because I agree that Peretz is not funny. That is to say, he is not in the business of providing light entertainment. He is not funny, God forbid, chas v'chalila. He doesn't fall into the trap that so much of the discussion of Yiddish culture, not here, of course, but is that Yiddish is somehow funny by its very essence. I won't say any more because I don't know what you're going to say. I don't want to. But I do think, however, that Peretz is someone who works very deeply with comedy. And perhaps this is simply because I'm writing a book on the history of Jewish comedy that's going to be coming out soon. My agent told me I needed to say that. And that, therefore, I'm thinking about everything in terms of comedy, but I don't think so. I think, ultimately, that Peretz, who starts out, as Michael said, as a writer swept up in the dynamics of the Haskalah, of the Jewish Enlightenment, was thinking, as all of these writers did, about comedy. It was one of the prime methods of working in the Jewish Enlightenment, and therefore had to reflect on what comedy meant and how it would work, because he was, of course, as Michael has said, a great and serious artist, and his fidelity to the ideal of art and its role in shaping culture in general, and of course Jewish culture, was so, so deep. And so he needed to think about what comedy could do, and not surprisingly, it ended up, given the title of what we are talking about this afternoon, it ended up vacillating in Peretz's mind between hope and fear. That is to say, he understood, like his contemporary Shalom Aleichem, that comedy could, or at least should, be in the business of providing hope. But every time he did it, it ended up expressing his fears. And as a result, much of his career, or much of the way in which he dealt with comedy through his career, was in playing out that tension and the dynamic. And like any artist, he vacillated in how he perceived that. But by looking at, and I'm going to be brief here because I know we have a lot to cover over the course of our speakers, by looking at a couple of his greatest stories, we're going to see sort of how comedy ends up working in his work and expressing nothing more and nothing less than his sensibility about the role of literature in Jewish life and modern culture, and also the way in reflecting on what a modern Jewish humor should be. So even though he was not someone like Peretz, not someone like Shalom Aleichem, who said in one of his letters, I have a sickness, I need to turn everything into laughter, I need to mock, I need to make fun. That was not Peretz's approach at all. But Peretz thought about comedy, he cared about it, as his great literary hero, Heinrich Heine, did. The title of my talk, Peretz's Jewish Comedy, is taken from a book called Heine's Jewish Comedy. It's an homage to that book. And it suggests, in the way that Peretz's hero did, that Peretz was convinced that literature and its comic treatment in some ways was a key to understanding how to operate in modern society, that it was capable, comedy that is, of the most vicious and deep and meaningful comments on that society, and ultimately that it was a savage weapon that had fearful consequences, and it was never quite clear who was on the end of the joke. So I hope to explain that to you very, very briefly by going through 3/4 stories and I'll explain what I mean by that as I go along. With 3 stories, or 3 or 4 stories that illustrate 3 different modes of Peretz's Jewish comedy, and they roughly correspond to 3 different ages in Peretz's literary career, although Peretz, again, was not a butterfly to be pinned and taxonomized by critics and analysts like myself. He was an artist and should be treated as such, so fidelity does not have to be something that we should hold him to. I'm going to do this because this is also a celebration of Peretz's work by celebrating some of his greatest stories, as I said. And the first one I want to treat is one of Peretz's arguably greatest stories, certainly it's his most famous story, and a story from the first part of his career, which is Bunch of Schweig, or Bunch of the Silent. I suspect that in this group, I don't need to rehearse the plot of the story to any of you, but I just want to remind you of the ending. And I want to remind you of the ending because the first 15 times I heard the story as a kid, I didn't actually hear this ending. The ending did not exist in the version of the story that I was told. So you all remember Bunch, he goes to heaven, and he is, his life is told and retold before the court that is sort of judging him. And ultimately, a divine voice tells him he could have shouted, he could have spoken up, he could have had anything, he would have brought down the walls, but in fact, he didn't, and as a result, for his silence, he can have anything he wants, right? Everyone knows the story, and of course, what does he ask for? Audience participation part, what does he ask for? That's right, a hot roll and fresh butter. Good, see, everyone's paying attention, very good. And of course, this is how, when I grew up in yeshiva, this is how I heard the story. Stopping there. And everyone said in the story in the yeshiva that I went to, isn't it wonderful? What a great guy. All of the treasure houses of heaven are open to him. And what is he's such a nice guy. He asks for just a roll. That's all he wants. Nothing, just carbs. Nothing else. And of course, this is not how Peretz intended the story. This is not how the story ends if you actually read the story. And here I pause to acknowledge another of my teachers, who I believe is not in the room, Ruth Weiss, who I read this story with in its full form first. And it says, of course, the story ends with a laugh. The story ends, apropos for our topic, it ends with a laugh. And that laugh is the laugh, of course, of the prosecutor, right? Everyone else bows their heads in shame at this meekness that the system has created, right? The prosecutor laughs, right? He laughs a satiric, mocking laugh. He actually laughs, according to the text, he laughs a bitter laugh, right? Because he very much speaks to Peretz's response at this particular moment. He says, look at this terrible thing. This terrible creature that has been created is exactly the opposite of Peretz in his socialist, activist, programmatic phase. Go out and fight. Don't be like Buncha. But he looks at the world around him and he laughs, this bitter laugh, which is a satirist's laugh. It is with fear of the society that is, but it's also, in some ways, mixed with a hope, perhaps, the satirist's hope, that the presentation of this terrible situation can inspire people to do better, right? A satirist, by definition, is torn between hope and fear. Fear of what is, hope of what could be, fear that this hope will not come to pass. Phase number 1. Phase number 2 also is a story that also ends with laughter, but with, if I may, a non-laugh. And that is another of Peretz's most famous stories, one that Michael mentioned previously, which is Ibnish nach Hecher, if not higher, right? Written 6 years later in 1900. All of you remember this story as well, which with the Litvak, right? He goes out, he finds what the Rebbe of Nemirov is up to when he is supposed to be going up, when he's supposed to be ascending to heaven. And Peretz here, of course, is relying on older stories of Hasidic literature in which a skeptic follows a Hasidic Rebbe who he is about to mock, he's about to satirize, right? But it turns out in these older Hasidic stories that the Hasidic Rebbe actually can perform miracles after all, and the mocker becomes a disciple, right? He becomes a follower, right? So it's a conversion story of a sort. And this, of course, is what happens as well in this story. Although, as all of you know, the Rebbe of Nemirov is not ascending to heaven. Where is he going? Anybody? He's going to chop wood. See, look, you guys, maybe I should just stop. You guys know all the stories. This is great. He knows all the story. He chops wood. He's going to chop wood. He follows him. Fantastic. He does become a disciple, right? And of course, when he talks, people talk about what the Rebbe is doing and that he ascends to heaven. Peretz says at the very last sentence of the story, he says that this man, now a disciple, this man now a chassid, does not laugh. That's explicitly in text. He does not laugh. Laughter is not part of his repertoire anymore. He simply says, if not higher, right? Right? Laughter may not be part of his repertoire, but a gentle comic smile certainly is, right? And that is because the disciple actually has the last laugh, right? How so? Because he hasn't converted after all, right? That is to say, he has basically determined that his own moral hierarchies, his own beliefs about what is the most important, that is, going out and helping people, are actually more important than a mystical, traditional Hasidic ascent to heaven, right? And it just so happens that the Rebbe is an excellent practitioner of his beliefs. So the Litvak didn't have to change his mind at all. He simply realized that the Rebbe agreed with him, right? In that sense, his humility is not really humility at all. It's a smug superiority that he actually knows is something better than all of the other people around him, right? Which is, in our fancy academic phrases, a way of just referring to this as irony, which is, of course, a kind of comedy. So Peretz here also believes in composing this story, in crafting this wonderful story, that he too has had the last laugh. That is, he is able to create a kind of literary cultural document that both has its traditional cake and eats it in its modern literary fashion too. Right? He is able to take the rubric of a Hasidic tale, and he is able to transform it into a story that privileges his own modern moral hierarchies while maintaining cultural continuity. What could be better than that? Right? And so Peretz himself, on the hope and fear side of the equation, has used comedy, irony here, in order to really express hope. Well, that would be great if those were the last treatments of literature that Peretz did, and we could all go home, we could be happy. But there is a third move that Peretz does as well, because in Peretz, nothing can stay still. Michael pointed out, I think so beautifully, how Peretz was always in motion. Peretz was always moving and always changing. And so hope in its dynamism transforms to fear. And here is where the third and fourth story that I want to talk about is. I could really give one, but I want to give two because they're both so good. I don't really have a good other reason for that. The first of them, the one which is published and I think is a way forward, is again a famous story, Dry Matanos, 3 Gifts, published in 1904. And Dry Matanos itself takes one of the most unfunny subjects in Jewish literature. It takes the martyrologies, and it tells 3 stories of tremendous sacrifice for devotion to traditional religion. And then at the end, in this kind of O. Henry twist that Peretz was so famous for, it does something with those gifts. And it treats them under the lens of irony. Now, it's not necessarily Peretz's irony. It's a character's irony. It's a voice's irony. And it says, right, if you remember, the last thing looking at those gifts says, what beautiful, it says something, I'm paraphrasing, of course. What beautiful gifts. Well, they're not very useful, right? They're nothing, they don't do much. But, you know, they are nice to look at. The first 2 moves that I've suggested to you, phase 1, Bonsha, phase 2, are both saying that literature is so amazing and so remarkable for Peretz because they do something. They forge a modern Jewish culture. They change that culture. Here, Peretz is concerned that the gifts of Jewish culture simply are nothing more than something nice to look at. Or at least that's what his ironic character has at the end of the story, and expressing, I think, a fear. Right? And it is a fear that is expressed in the form of comedy, an ironic comment, a smug, superior joke, taking all of this and turning it into a joke. Is this Peretz lashing out against the narrator or the speaker of this final line? Or is it Peretz acknowledging this fear? I think that's something for various interpreters of the story to discuss. But I'm going to end, because again we're short on time, with a final story that expresses this fear, because it is a story that speaks to endings. It is a story that is the end of, written at the end of his life, in the year of his death, 100 years ago today, and it is a story which itself also deals with afterlife, so it provides a nice bookend to the bunch of story that I began with. That story is Ne'ilah in Gehenna, which is often translated as Yom Kippur in hell, and it is a story, again, which has a similar kind of move as Dry Matanos, which is why I'm dealing with both of them together. In that story, as you'll recall, it ends with, or it almost ends, with an act of great artistic power and redemption. The person who delivers the Ne'ilah in Gehenna, if you'll recall, is a chazan, is a cantor, right, who has been responsible for a remarkable feat, right? Nobody in his town has ever gone to Gehenna. Right? Does anyone remember, this is a side note, does anyone remember what that town's name is? Anyone? It's called Lahadam, which is an acronym in Hebrew or Yiddish for what? Anyone know? Lo hayu devarim me'olam, right? Never existed. So Peretz is a little joke there, right? This town never actually existed, right? I also love, by the fact, given our technological concerns today, that the story itself is premised on a technological development, which is the modern filing system. Hell has modernized in Peretz's story. It develops a first-class filing system. They now can finally sort out where all the souls come from. They can do a kind of proto-computer search. And they realize no one has ever come from Lahadam, right? Which is one of the reasons. And then they find out this cantor is responsible because he sings so beautifully that he is able to elevate all of the souls from their sinful states, and therefore they don't go to Gehenna. Right? This is what, through a series of circumstances I will not bother to rehearse, this is what he does in hell itself. He is sent to hell, he does it as himself, and he elevates all of these souls. Again, as Michael suggested, the act of a remarkable artist in order to achieve transcendence and redemption through his art, in this case, the beautiful singing. Right? But again, the story ends with a joke, and not a very good one either. Right? The joke says, the last line says, after a while, hell filled up again. In fact, they needed expansion because more people were coming in all the time. Right? That's the end of Peretz's story. Hope in the penultimate sentence, fear expressed through comic irony in the ultimate sentence. Now, which one does Peretz want us to leave with? The hope or the fear? The legacy of Peretz's stories have often been, as I told you from my own experiences in yeshiva, to land on the positive, to land on the hope, to remember Bunch's valiant sacrifice and not the satiric aspect of it, to remember the beauty of the social justice and not sort of the smuggery, to remember the power of the martyrology and not that final line. And that is one legacy of Peretz's. But there's that other legacy too. And I think it speaks to Peretz's power as an artist that he would want us on this yard site to remember both hope and fear, to remember both sides, and to remember them comically and tragically. Thank you very much.
The image on the screen, for those of you who may not know, this is, in fact, a recent photograph of the mausoleum to Peretz, to Dinesen, and to Ansky in the Warsaw Cemetery. Our next speaker is Ken Frieden, who is the B.G. Rudolph Professor of Judaic Studies at Syracuse University. His books include classic Yiddish fiction and anthologies of Yiddish literature and translation, such as Tales of Mendele, the Book Peddler, and classic Yiddish stories. He has been a visiting professor at universities of Tel Aviv, Haifa, Heidelberg, and UC Davis. He has been research fellow at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, at the Free University of Berlin, and at Harvard. At Syracuse University, Frieden edits the series on Judaic traditions in literature, music, and art. He translates from Yiddish and Hebrew and has edited collections of short stories by the Israeli authors Etgar Keret and David Ehrlich. Ken?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, to have a chance to speak with you. I'll take a slightly different angle, emphasizing Peretz's contribution to literary history. When I finished my book on the three classic Yiddish authors, I had a bad taste in my mouth because I had come to feel that Abramovich's or Mendeley's Hebrew stories had been overvalued, and Peretz's Hebrew stories had been undervalued. So it took me some more years, but I gradually came to understand things a little bit differently, and I want to talk about that today. Peretz was open to other sources in folk Hebrew than were really considered acceptable at the time. And so basically what I'll be talking about is the high road that many critics saw from the Haskalah to Mendeley versus the low road from Hasidism to Peretz. So in addition to making a vast contribution to Yiddish literary history, Peretz developed an important, innovative Hebrew style. He was at the center of the modernist movement in Warsaw, which offered alternatives to the Odessa Circle. The literary aesthetics of Odessa were firmly rooted in the 19th century, with an Enlightenment bent. Peretz offered a viable alternative, helping to bring Yiddish into the 20th century. In Hebrew, he showed how it was possible to move beyond Mendeley's Nusach. Hebraists had a hard time acknowledging Peretz's influence, however, since he was so associated with Yiddish literature. The time has come to reevaluate Peretz's Hebrew stories alongside his Hebrew works. Even Chaim Nachman Bialik admired Peretz's Hebrew, urging him to write more, but Peretz kept a delicate balance between his writing in the two languages. He wrote some of his most interesting works in Hebrew before translating them into Yiddish, while others began in Yiddish before he prepared Hebrew versions. What's the secret behind Peretz's bilingualism? Already by 1890, Peretz leaned toward impressionistic writing and usually did not strive to give hard-edged, realistic descriptions. That's why his travel narrative, Bilder von einer Provinzreise, Pictures from a Provincial Journey, is so unusual. His descriptions focus on eccentric characters, a maskil in a shtetl, an impoverished rabbi, a madman. When he arrives at Lashev at night, he describes the market square. Inmitten Mark liegen ungeworfene weiße Steine. Ich fort zu Nenter, die Steine rühren sich, kriegen Hörner. Es wird von sie a Masse herrlich weiße Ziegen. In the middle of the market lie scattered white stones. I ride closer, the stones move, grow horns, and turn into a mass of glorious white goats. Subjective impressions are central to his travel descriptions. So Peretz wasn't writing in the tradition of 19th century realism. He tried his hand at Enlightenment satire, but that wasn't the solution for him either. He hit his stride when he started to work with folk traditions, starting from Hasidic stories. Is Hasidic writing part of Hebrew and Yiddish literary history? Peretz, unlike many literary critics, said that it was. Not only that, he said that Hasidic writing was one of the main sources of modern Jewish literature. I'll explain why Peretz held this view, how it separated him from other authors, and how it characterizes his own writing. In his 1908 Chernovitz speech, Peretz emphasized the place of Hasidic stories in Jewish literature. Yiddish literature didn't start with Isaac Meir Dick, Peretz said. Das Hasidische Meisele, das ist der Bereshis. The Hasidic story, that's the Genesis. Peretz didn't come to this conclusion easily. In the 1870s, he tried his hand as a Maskilic Hebrew poet. Between 1886 and 1894, he wrote some Hebrew stories that had elements of Enlightenment satire. By 1901, however, he had shown that he could reappropriate the genre of Hasidic stories for his own purposes. This led to his creation of the volume called Chassidish in Yiddish and Chassidut in Hebrew. This was a radical innovation. Throughout the 19th century, Maskilim had been attacking the backwardness of the Chassidim. For Peretz to write neo-Chassidic stories marked a new phase in Hebrew and Yiddish fiction. How did Peretz transcend ideological differences to incorporate Chassidic elements in his fiction? The two seminal narrative works in the Chassidic tradition are Shifrei HaBesht and Nachman Sipurei Maises, both from 1814 to 1815. So in addition to marking the centennial of Peretz's death, we're actually marking the bicentennial of two of the most important Hasidic publications. Shifrei HaBesht, in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, is hagiographic tales about the Baal Shem, and it was immediately a bestseller in Hebrew. Within 3 years, there were numerous Hebrew editions and translations into Yiddish. The Hebrew is accessible because it uses a simple vocabulary, heavily laced with words that are familiar to Yiddish speakers. Moreover, the grammar often suggests that there's a Yiddish subtext. This characteristic was important to Peretz because it helped to break down the barrier between elite Hebrew and folksy Yiddish. The same is even truer of Nachman's Sipurei Maises, which have almost always been published in a bilingual Hebrew-Yiddish edition. Nachman told the stories in Yiddish, and his scribe Nathan Steinhartz first wrote them down in Hebrew. The simple, accessible Hebrew often echoes Yiddish. Translation marks almost all of the texts associated with Rabbi Nachman. The Hebrew writing is almost always by Nathan Steinhartz, who was trying to remain as faithful as possible to Nachman's oral Yiddish. I tried for years to appreciate the Hebrew of Shifrei HaBesht. It wasn't until I read a Yiddish translation that I began to understand the power and the charm of the Hebrew original. Often you need to think in Yiddish while reading Hasidic Hebrew. That's why the Maskilim thought that it was just bad Hebrew. But it's also why Hasidic writers were more accessible. Peretz learned something about writing lively Hebrew from Hasidic authors. Basically, instead of following the Maskilic model and trying to sound biblical, he breathed life into Hebrew by sounding Yiddish. A historical accident informed Peretz's discovery of some of the Hasidic writing. Just as a side note, the Tsarist authorities had suppressed Hebrew publishing in the 1820s. And as a result, two important works by Nathan Steinhartz were delayed into the 1870s. It's certain that Peretz read the hagiographic book about Rabbi Nachman, Chayei Moharan, after it was published in 1874. And I'm sure that its Yiddish-inflected Hebrew style opened up new possibilities for Peretz. If we go back to Nachman's tales, we see how interwoven the Yiddish and the Hebrew are. Here's an example from Tale 1, The Loss of the Princess, and I gave you in a handout you may or may not have, just the Yiddish. And to mark how the Yiddish partakes of the Hebrew, Einmal is gewein a Melech. Der Melech hat gehad 6 Sinn und 1 Tochter. Die Tochter ist bei ihm sehr choshev gewein und hat sie sehr mechabev gewein und hat sich mit ihr sehr musta'asher gewein. Und mal ist auf ihr Broges geworden. So again and again, it's Hebrew words in Yiddish, and then Yiddish words come into the Hebrew also. In just the opening sentences, the Hebrew and Yiddish overlap in their use of more than a dozen words, from melech to choshev to mechabev to mishasheh and broges. The proportion of Hebrew is unusually high, with words like mitzaer, malchus, machmes, mishares, hatzois, midbarius, meyashev. And the Hebrew sometimes directly calques the Yiddish, as in the formulation hayam meyashev etzmo, for hot sich meyashev gewein. Peretz stated that modern Jewish literature started with Shifrei HaBesht and Nachman's tales. Shifrei Baal Shem und andere Wundergeschichten seien Volksdichtungen. Der erste Volksdichter ist Reb Nachman von Breslev mit seinen 7 Bettler. Shifrei HaBesht and other miraculous stories are folk creations, and the first folk poet is Rabbi Nachman of Breslev with his 7 beggars. Before Peretz, few modern writers expressed affinity for Hasidic writing, for both ideological and literary reasons. They saw Hasidic life as antithetical to modern literature. Even Peretz seems to have started with this view. His earliest quasi-Hasidic story, Kabbalists, contains a streak of hostile satire. What should be a hagiographic tale turns into a tacit critique of the rabbi, whose mystical teachings lead to the death of his last student. That's from 1891 in Hebrew and 1894 in Yiddish. The Hebrew version specifies that the characters are Chabad Hasidim, but in the Yiddish version he eliminates that to make the story more generic. In the course of the 1890s, Peretz realized that the neo-Hasidic genre could provide the basis for something positive. In Mishnas Hasidim, Teachings of the Hasidim, from 1894 in Hebrew and then 1902 in Yiddish, Peretz creates a Hasidic narrator who seems to be based on Nathan Sternhardt's, Rabbi Nachman's scribe. Peretz signed this story with a pseudonym persona, the orphan from Nemirov, alluding probably to Sternhardt's town. When Nachman died in 1810, Sternhardt felt orphaned, and he devoted the rest of his life to writing about the Rebbe. So Peretz created a story that is in the vein of Sternhardt's hagiographic writings. This was one of Peretz's earliest and best neo-Hasidic tales. It's an artful reworking, an as-if Hasidic story that's been reshaped into a modern story. The Yiddish version preserves much of the Hebrew, as in the beginning. Es ist Yadua Lakol, die ganze Welt weiß, als der Admor von Nemirov hat gedient dem Rabbonische Olam mitoch Simcha. It's known to all, the entire world knows, that the Admor of Nemirov served God in joy. But in English, we'll use the essential thing, which is the inlaid Hebrew. The Yiddish is saturated with Hebrew. Many features echo Sternhardt's writings about Nachman. The Rebbe gives sermons that resemble parts of Nachman's writings, referring to joy, music, song, and dance. The narrator expresses his enthusiasm with familiar phrases like, Wohl ist die Augen, was haben solche gewehen zu sehen die Simcha beim Admor. Happy are the eyes that were privileged to see the joy of our master, teacher, and Rebbe. There's a description of the Rebbe, of the wedding's daughter, as there is in writings about Nachman. But Peretz turns this into something else by introducing a discordant note. It turns out that the Rebbe's new son-in-law is not Hasidic, and in fact he's a student of the Vilna Gaon. This unsettles the impression of an as-if Hasidic story and makes clear that it's something else. The narrator is somehow at a loss, unable to fit the events into the comfortable shape of a traditional hagiographic tale. Instead, the Rebbe's choice of a mitnagdik son-in-law is a mystery that eludes the narrator's understanding. Peretz's Hebrew version, following Hasidic examples, bears the mark of Yiddish. For example, in Hebrew, Peretz sometimes uses ha'olam in the Yiddish sense, meaning not the world, but the people. And in another passage, Peretz even uses the phrase kol ha'olam kulo in quotation marks, I think alluding to Nachman's famous saying, kol ha'olam kulo gesher tzar ma'od. During the course of the 1890s, Peretz realized that Hasidic stories were a possible source of inspiration. By taking on voices of Hasidic narrators, he was able to create a folksy voice in both Hebrew and Yiddish. This was a significant shift for Peretz, who had previously strived to use avant-garde European literary techniques. His first Yiddish book, Bekannte Bilder, Familiar Scenes, from 1890, experimented with a very avant-garde form, internal monologue technique. It included the Meshugana Batlin, the Mad Talmudist, and the Meshulach, the messenger, and it explored consciousness in extreme circumstances. This could even be called the beginning of Yiddish modernism. But Peretz also contributed to Yiddish and Hebrew modernism by returning to the folk. He was inspired by ethnography, as European artists and composers were inspired by folk art and folk music. The turn to Hasidic narrators advanced Peretz's development both in Yiddish and Hebrew. To understand Peretz's innovation, we should recall Yosef Perl's satire of Hasidic letters in Megalat Tmirin, Revealer of Secrets, from 1819. Most Hebrew writers in the 19th century viewed Hasidic writing as barbaric, but not Peretz. He saw Hasidic writing as offering a more direct style, almost an aesthetic of simplicity. That's why Yochanan Melamed, one of Peretz's narrators from 1897, can say, Ich bin, Baruch Hashem, kein Schreiber nicht. I am, thank God, no writer. An even more direct borrowing is found in the story Reb Nachman Kizmaises, as David Roski's comments in his book A Bridge of Longing. The narrator is clearly modeled on Nosson Nemerov, or Nathan Sternhardt's. That began in 1903 and continued in Yiddish. Perhaps surprisingly, Peretz was never attracted to real Hasidism. He said that he never visited a Rebbe. His purpose was not to document reality or even to critique it. It was a literary inspiration when Peretz developed a distinctive way of relating to Hasidism in his stories. He began with a bit of satire but moved beyond it. By 1900, he was able to write the masterful story Between Two Mountains, narrated by a Hasidic disciple of the Rebbe of Biala. Instead of describing Hasidic life from the outside, Peretz gives us a subjective, a Hasidic perspective. Shmaya is the Hasid who narrates the story. He has a strong bias toward the Rebbe, and he's critical of the Misnagdim. But even though he narrates, the story is bigger than his Hasidic perspective. It revolves around the tension between the Rebbe of Biala and the Rabbi of Brisk. Even through the eyes of the biased narrator, we see that the Rabbi of Brisk is also admirable in his way. Describing the Rabbi when he teaches, the narrator says, Ob die Teure is a Yam, is gewehen de Leviosen in Yam. Mit ein Tenua geht a Schwimm durch 10 Mesechtes. Mit ein Tenua mischt ois Schas v'poskim. Als es hilcht und spritzt, siedet und kocht, Taka, wie man erzählt von Emes in Yam. The Torah is a sea, he was the Leviathan in the sea. In one motion he swam through 10 tractates of the Talmud. In one motion he reconciled the Mishnah with its commentaries. It resounded and spattered, seethed and boiled, as one says of the real sea. And this is a Hasidic narrator describing a Misnagid. Echoing Hasidic authors, Peretz saturates the Yiddish with Hebrew. He also takes the opposition between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, symbolically representing the larger conflict between emotion and reason. Both are necessary, both are valid. The narrator prefers the warmer world of his Rebbe, but we recognize that his perspective is limited. Peretz also saw his own identity as being torn between reason and emotion. His Zichroines, his memoirs, begins with this opposition between a logical mind and a heart full of feeling. They never connect or unite. Peretz recognized that Enlightenment rationalism was not enough, and Enlightenment Hebrew was too limited. Hasidism introduced the emotional world of everyday life, and Peretz channeled it into some of his best writing. So we've seen that Peretz recycled the genre of Hasidic hagiography, transforming it by giving it the shape of a modern short story. When he moved from Hebrew to Yiddish, Peretz brought the sacred aura of Hebrew into the folksy Yiddish context. But Peretz also moved in the opposite direction from Yiddish to Hebrew, following a basic characteristic of Hasidic writing. Nachman's tales were first told orally in Yiddish before they were written in Hebrew, and Nathan Sternhardt's tried to stay close to the original. This resulted in a Yiddish-inflected Hebrew that was accessible and lively. The Maskilim mocked it, but the joke was on them, because most of the ornate, quasi-biblical writings of the Maskilim have been forgotten, while the seminal Hasidic writings from 2 centuries ago are still popular. As the Haskalah spread eastward from Berlin, many newly enlightened Hebrew writers in Galicia and Russia tried to follow the lead of the early Maskilim, but their neo-biblical ornamental militzah was never really viable. It was accessible to a tiny elite and was out of touch with centuries of post-biblical rabbinic writing. Peretz was able to contribute something different during the time of the Techiyah, the so-called revival of Hebrew. Bialik and others saw Mendeley's Nusach as the foundation of a new Hebrew style. In Hebrew, Abramovich started from the old neo-biblical style in the 1850s and 1860s. Then he expanded beyond it in the 1870s and 1880s. This resulted in a synthetic style that brought together different historical layers. Bialik followed his example and built upon it, also writing influential essays about Mendeley's Nusach. There were modernist rebellions by authors like Brenner and Gnessen, but Mendeley's Nusach was often seen as the dominant style of modern Hebrew literature. After he took up Neo-Hasidic writing, Peretz contributed something wholly other from a radically different source, and I think Gershon Shaked referred to it as Hanusach Shekeneged, the opposing Nusach. Between Yiddish and Hebrew, Peretz helped to shape a Hebrew style that sounded more like everyday speech. It was also more accessible to readers because it was closer to Yiddish. That's true until today. From teaching in Israel, I know that it's easier for Israelis today to read Peretz than it is to read Abramovich, Mendeley. And I think that's in part because Israeli Hebrew itself has been so heavily influenced by Yiddish. The evolution of Hebrew in Palestine repeated some elements of this alternate Hebrew style. What appeared barbaric to Yosef Perl in 1819 started to become typical a century later. In 1937, Zalman Kalmanovich noted this parallel. If one may say that Hebrew also lived among the Jewish people before the recent attempt to revive it as a spoken language, it lived in exactly this form of a folkloristic Hebrew, as one could characterize it, and it still, that is in 1937, sounds this way in the land of Israel, in the mouths of adults who come from among the Yiddish-speaking communities. The Maskilim tried to suppress Yiddish and post-biblical Hebrew. That enabled them to place themselves above contemporary rabbis, but it also distanced them from readers and ultimately made their writings less central to literary history. In contrast, Peretz embraced folk Hebrew and his Neo-Hasidic tales. So the secret of Peretz's bilingualism is that he brought Hebrew and Yiddish closer together. He wrote dozens of Hebrew stories, often capturing the feel of everyday speech. He helped to reinvent spoken Hebrew by creating oral-style narrators. Take the beginning, just for instance, of the story Hanadiv, published 1895. You asked while I moved my dwelling to Warsaw, Atem sho'olim oti, medua he'etakti et moshevi levarsha. The same applies to the stories of Yochanan HaMelamed and the best Neo-Hasidic stories. Even when Peretz wrote short Hebrew plays, encouraged by Bialik, he often excelled in conveying dialogue. Abramovich, or Mendeley, also started in Hebrew, shifted to Yiddish, and returned to Hebrew. He expanded his Hebrew by drawing from ancient, medieval, and pre-modern historical layers. While that historical range worked for Bialik's poetry, it was too erudite for many readers. That's why Peretz's writings in a Neo-Hasidic mode contributed something so different. It built upon folk traditions, both in its content and in its style. Peretz developed a direct style, which was more accessible because it echoed folk narrative. In Hebrew, he was unpretentious and didn't mind sounding close to Yiddish. In Yiddish, he emulated folk voices, but voices that sounded different from Sholem Aleichem's monologues. And you may recall Peretz was first appreciated by Sholem Aleichem, according to the story, after Volkstümliche Geschichten. When Sholem Aleichem read them, he said he went to a mirror and slapped himself in the face for not understanding how important Peretz was as a writer. Peretz had showed that he could be avant-garde by 1890 with internal monologue stories, but then he developed another kind of avant-garde by tapping into Hasidic traditions. This freed him from the need to sound like writers in the Odessa circle of Mendeley's Nusach. Both in Hebrew and in Yiddish, Peretz helped writers break free from Enlightenment style and ideology. Instead of writing anti-Hasidic stories, as was common in the 19th century, Peretz reappropriated Hasidic traditions. Hasidic narratives became the raw material for Jewish modernism in a neo-romantic mode. Peretz showed how modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature could develop together, influencing one another. He was right. This is what happened. In spite of the suppression of Yiddish in Israel, Yiddish remains present in Israeli Hebrew. Hasidic Hebrew and Peretz's literary remaking of Hasidic Hebrew anticipated this phenomenon. I imagine this is somewhat controversial. Peretz helped to popularize the simpler, folksy Hebrew associated with the Hasidim, and I'm suggesting that Hasidic Hebrew influenced what became Israeli Hebrew. Zionist literary historians took the high road from the Enlightenment Hebrew to Mendeley's Nusach. In retrospect, however, it's easier to see how the Yiddishized Hebrew of popular writing became part of Israeli Hebrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. It's appropriate to conclude the talks today with Martin Peretz, who is a relative of Yud Lamed Peretz. He was raised in a Yiddishist household in New York, attending Sholem Aleichem Volksschule, number 45, the Sholem Aleichem Mittelschule, and the Jewish Teachers Seminary, where he studied with Shmuel Niger and Philip Friedman. Peretz received his PhD from Harvard University, a lecturer at Harvard for nearly 50 years. Peretz endowed the university's Martin Peretz Chair in Yiddish Literature, whose first incumbent was Ruth Weiss. From 1973 to 2011, Peretz was the editor-in-chief of the New Republic and is politically active in the defense of Israel today. He is currently working on a memoir, The Book of Grudges and Other Loves. In 1952, Peretz spoke at the 100th anniversary of Yud Lamed Peretz's birth and dedication of Yud Lamed Peretz's Square on the Lower East Side. Martin Peretz is a trustee of YIVO, and it's a real pleasure and honor to have him speak today.
Hi. I begin with a citation to my student, Jeremy Dauber, to whom I did not teach Yiddish or Yiddish literature, but social theory. And as you shall hear soon, I speak to you not as a scholar at all, but as a reasonably intelligent reader who knows Yiddish, went to a Yiddish Volksschule, then to Mittelschule, and before college to the Yiddish Lehrer seminar, where I studied, I'm repeating Jonathan's introduction, where I studied with at least two giants of Jewish learning, Shmuel Niger in literature, and a friend of sorts, an acolyte of Peretz himself, and the historian Philip Friedman, a pioneering scholar of the Chorban, who were also, of course, luminaries at YIVO. About my Shula experience, I went through the schools of the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute, idiosyncratically a middle-class institution, Yiddishist and Zionist. So why did I attend not the Yud Lamed Peretz Shulas? Because those were, despite Peretz's hostility to Orthodox socialism and Sholem Aleichem's garbled fondness for it, the label the communist and fellow traveling Jews put Peretz's name on their schools made it almost impossible for me to go because my father hated the communists. He used to call them Die Reute Yidelach. What happened in the shulas was replicated in the summer camps, Boiberik and Kinderland. There were others, of course, Kindering of the Workmen's Circle, Kinderwald of the Yiddish labor Zionists, Nit Gedeiget, others. It was a phenomena that has disappeared, literally disappeared. But in those days, in 1940s, 1950s, there were camps like those in California, Illinois, Michigan, Massachusetts, Maryland, Canada, etc. In Biberek, we observed Tisha B'Av, young and younger, saying a transcendental Kaddish for the masters of secular Jewish culture, Shimon Dubnov, for example, and the innocent millions who perished. On one Tisha B'Av at Camp Biberek, I read, or rather recited in Yiddish, Kadya Melodowska's threnodic poem, Merciful God. And I imagine, and I'm gonna, can I read it to you? God of mercy, choose another people. We are tired of death, tired of corpses. We have no more prayers. Choose yourself another people. We have run out of blood, of victims. Oh, Lord, I can't read my own handwriting. Well, I'm going to skip 2 lines. The earth lacks space for tombstones. There are no more tombstones. There are no more lamentations. No songs of awe in the ancient texts. God of mercy, sanctify another Sinai. We have covered every field and stone with ashes and holiness, with our corpses, with our young, with our infants. We have paid for each letter in your commandments. God of mercy, lift up your tired brow, look on the people of the world, let them have the prophecies and holy days. God of mercy, to us just give rough clothing of shepherds who tend, of blacksmiths at the hammer. And one more thing, O God of mercy, give us our blessings, take back the divine glory of our genius. It's a poem that I read it at Camp Biberek, probably in 1954, at a Tisha B'Av event. Oh yes, Jeremy Dauber. Well, I didn't begin with a citation from him, but I will now. I.L. Peretz, whose folk bibliothèque contribution, the poem Monish, would mark the beginning of one of the most celebrated careers in Yiddish literary history, was then so unfamiliar with Yiddish literature, he apparently confused Mendele and Shalom Aleichem, Shalom Rabinovich, and Shalom Abramovich. He was at the time a Hebrew poet of middling fame and a lawyer who, due to his recent disbarment, was looking for sources of income. When a friend told him about the Volksbibliothek and its wealthy publisher, he saw opportunity. But Shalom Aleichem felt the poem's ironic tone and German-affected language would have puzzled and alienated much of the anthology's potential audience in other parts of the Pale. When he asked for revisions to make the poem more generally palatable, Peretz's discomfort was palpable. Palatable, palpable, very good. Your wish and goal, as far as I understand it, he wrote, is to write for the sake of the audience that speaks jargon of jargonland. I, for my part, write for my own pleasure, and if I take any reader into consideration, he is of the higher level of society. Peretz's artistic credo, even complete with a elitist caveat, is hardly unfamiliar to modern readers of literary fiction. But it was deeply foreign to highbrow Yiddish literature of the time, with the Haskalah-influenced polemical ethos, which meant reaching audiences, and particularly to Shalom Aleichem, who had his own interest in being broadly accepted and loved. He made the changes without Peretz's approval, nonetheless, marking the beginning of a charged relationship between two men who would grow to become among Yiddish's most influential writers, each championing a different vision of what the literature should be. It's true. Wait. Among the three patriarchs of Yiddish belles lettres, two introduced themselves to their readers and to their Jewish world and to the Jewish world with pseudonyms. Their intellectual competitor would have, had he had English, would have labeled Mendele Mechesforim Mendele and Shalom Aleichem a nickname, but not as a self-caricature. Rather, he saw these as a conceit, aiming to inveigle or entrap the innocent Yiddish reader into a frolic. Indeed, that's what the AKA, the pen name, the alias, stage name means. I read a wonderful book, incandescent in its insights, by Jan Schwartz, imagining lives, autobiographical fiction of I didn't bring his book. So there we are. In it he gives a special place to Jakob Glatstein, a poet I knew as a child, a magnificent poet who even before the war saw vividly the meaning and inevitability of the catastrophe. And to Chaim Grada, whose unpublished work YIVO will be publishing, an apparently incandescent novel. But we also know my quarrel with Herr Schwarzeiner, an old dispute between two young acquaintances in three parts, ending in the Paris metro after the war, an argument between two yeshiva bechorim and about the existence of God. One is still a believer, fervent and righteous. The other is not a cynic, but a deep non-believer who wants still to love his brother. Grada does not believe in the God who has betrayed his people. And Gratz had an epitaph for Soviet Jewry. These two, those who had been promised socialism and lived in the deceits of communism, murderers, self-deceits, pronounced by these serious literati and believed by Yiddish-speaking masses in the USSR, the US, and elsewhere where the red flag flew. That's that wonderful poem, Epitaph for the Night of the Murdered Poets. And I look it up in the Irving Howe anthology of Yiddish poetry. It's the last poem in the book. In the end, I suppose, aside from Zionism in the State of Israel, a free Jewish choice of what the Jewish people were to become was not available, although there were many options argued about for and against. Of course, it is not surprising that there were ongoing argumentations among Jewish intellectuals as to what the Jewish people were, and if they were a people at all. Some of the discourse and discord could be seen through the lens of geography. Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe. No one took seriously the masses of a more or less, aside from that, no one in Europe took seriously the masses of a more or less linguistically coherent bloc of Spanish, Greek, Turkish, and Middle Eastern Jews with a history that goes back to the destruction of the First Temple and was still vibrant in Iraq and Persia in 1948. Peretz was the leading figure at the Chernovitz Conference in 1908. Looking back on it, one may imagine it from the point of view of cruel time as a party before a Shiva. But the unimaginable was not imagined, and much of the planning of the conference dealt with the avoidance of Hebrew, even as a topic. Peretz was a particularly ambivalent figure and ambiguous too. After all, he wrote and, of course, read in Hebrew, even spoke in Hebrew, and so did Mendele and Shalom Aleichem. But he saw in Hebrew a competitor, even an antagonist. And on the language front, it was, how could a small people dispersed increasingly across oceans support and speak to think and write in two languages? That Peretz did it was no model. David Gratz, who leads a remarkable life. He lives in Scotland and in Vilna, and he's the son of whom? Menke Gratz. That historical role was left to Peretz, who picked up the thread when he launched the new ethos of Yiddishism with his Yiddische Bibliothek in Warsaw in 1891. The founding editorial includes the following. Our enemies say that Jews in general are parasites. Our chauvinists say that the Israelite is God's only chosen. We say simply that we Jews are people like all people with virtues and faults. We have a lot to thank the diaspora for. Many good things, but many painful ones too. In the millennial struggle for existence in ancient times, when all nations built up power and used it for murder, burning, and forcing one's will on others, we built up strength and used it for being patient, enduring, tolerating, to live through the bad times. The other force, military power, grows only until the time when it meets a greater force and bursts like a soap bubble. Our strength cannot be outmatched. For the time that we have been living in the diaspora, we don't have on the conscience of our Judaism, a single drop of foreign blood. I wonder, and I don't know how many Jews wrote, read, and spoke Hebrew in Eastern Europe in the 1870s and 80s. Have any of you have a sense? I mean, I was taught that Eliezer ben Yehuda invented modern Hebrew. Did he? No. So give me an estimate of, I mean, I know there were a lot of Hebrew magazines and books. How many Jews spoke Hebrew? Next to none. Okay. There was certainly more than a few handfuls, maybe thousands, long before Eliezer ben Yehuda began his slow but insistent war for Hebrew in the Holy Land. And he was insistent. Coming home with his wife one night, he heard a babysitter singing to his young child in Yiddish, and he fired her on the spot. There was, in fact, a war against Yiddish in Jewish Palestine, and a persistent war, actually using the melodic train in Jewish life as a symbol of weakness and defeat. In truth, Zionism had a strain, and not a thin strain, of pogrom against Yiddish. There were some defenses. For example, the League for the Rights of Yiddish in the Land of Israel. But Peretz's 100th Yortzeit is being observed in Israel with conferences, exhibits, even concerts. Still, I shudder when I walk into the Florentine neighborhood in Tel Aviv and find myself walking on Ayel Peretz Street, a shabby alley heading two ways, the first leading into the depressed and depressing Eritrean neighborhood, a center of living tragedy. The second, the hip Gegend, the hip neighborhood of artists, musicians, hangers-on, progressive druggies, confused Palestinians who wonder about crossing the green line and living among the enemy. I once had a conversation with a waiter who had asked about the name on my credit card. He was a poet, he said, and he loved Monish. He was translating it into Arabic. He was Jewish. It was or should have been obvious that the two movements among both Jewish intellectuals and the Jewish working class would come to blows. Okay, not to blows. Peretz, coming down from his lofty place, put in at Chernovitz that Hebrew, too, was a national language of the Jewish people. Kalman Weiser and Joshua Fogel have edited a vibrant, vivid, and deeply researched book, Chernovitz at 100, that lays out almost all of the salient issues about the future of Yiddish before the First World War. But the future of Yiddish before the First World War was different after the war. There are a few postscripts one of especial importance: the rise of the Soviet Union and its manipulation of the Jewish sensibility towards class warfare and Stalin. This, in the Chernovitz volume, a short essay about a Paris conference. There is in this Chernovitz volume a short essay about about a Paris conference held in 1937 in defense of Yiddish, the culture, and the language. Alas, it was organized as a front for the Yiddish communists who were not yet being persecuted and shot, for which one would have to wait only 7 or 8 years. YIVO refused to attend, and there proceeded to be a culture conf between us and Yakuf for decades and decades. Is it over? Thank you.
So, hello. Oh, Michael?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, good, good. So, it's 4:30. There's a lot to talk about, it seems to me, but I wonder whether we should start with questions from the audience that might stimulate some conversation. So, I think we've connected to R2D2 as well. But so if there are questions from the audience, please raise your hand and perhaps we can begin the conversation that way. Yes.
First of all, I learned a great deal. Excellent, excellent. Both of you are great professors, and I'm looking forward to hear more and more. In my life, I made an arrangement with a fellow above to live till 120, so I'll come around. But my question is, I'm a teacher, why didn't you mention the fact of Yud Lamed Peretz and children? He devoted a great deal of his life to his children. His small, tiny little poems about 4 children, like Tanz, Tanz, Mädele Tanz in den Blumengranz. Says der Himmel lacht mit Tränen, du wirst bald at Kalkberg. That's one beautiful poem, a beautiful poetry, which expresses a child, especially after World War I, or during World War I, actually, because he died in 1916, so the World War was on already for 2 consecutive years. And he was in charge of a Bet Yesomim. In Israel, it's a Bet Yatomim. I didn't know what he's talking about. But then I realized it's a basis Yesomim. Basis Yesomim. The house, like Korchak in his day. So was Peretz way before him. And perhaps Korchak learned from Yud Lamed Peretz the love for children. And in our Yiddish literature, his poems about children, and his poetry, especially, a great poetry, and lovely. And I'm sure none of you have mentioned Chawal.
Anybody want to talk about that? It seems like a very good subject.
About his children?
Yes, his children. Children's writings for children.
I want to talk about his child. I don't know his writing for children, but I do know something about his personal life. He had a first wife whom he divorced. He had a second wife called Helena, and they had and his first child with his first wife was called Lucien. Helena, this is a little more.
My question was not about his personal life. My question was his contribution to poetry and to Yiddish literature as flourish.
Well, let me answer the question that wasn't asked, and because it's interesting. Lucien and he had terrible, terrible fights. And Lucien either converted and Helena, and there are short memoirs of the Peretz household, and they don't agree with one another. But their differences are in the intensity of disagreement that there was in the household. Helena, after Peretz died, came to live in Levertov, where my parents lived. And my mother was a daughter of a rich family. I don't know how rich, probably not very rich, but a rich family. And Helena was her French teacher, a French teacher in Levertov. Oh my God. And Helena said to my mother, apparently lots of times, that a person of your class should not speak Yiddish in the street. So there was a tension in Peretz's own household about the use of Yiddish, which of course was obvious. And now the two guys who know things.
Well, no, I'm not an expert on the children's writing, but
More an expert than I am.
I don't think that Peretz was a great poet. I think that his greater contribution is in prose. So maybe that's why I shied away from his poetry. The same with the other classic writers; they were not great poets.
I'll just say one thing, which is that Peretz, like I think all of us have said at one point or another, as he was so interested in the future, he was so future-oriented, thinking about. Naturally, he would turn his attentions and thoughts to the symbols, the of that future, the children. And it's not surprising, I think, that he worked so much in genres that supped from the same table as those genres that have fascinated children for time immemorial: the folk tale, the fairy tale, and so many others. But he reminds me in that sense of the thief with a hole in his pocket, that every time he visits these child genres, he produces work that can work on many multiple levels and can attract sort of a wide variety of people. So these stories that can be told and read by Peretz's children's stories, some of them also have these wonderful multiple levels that enchant children of all ages, for lack of a better phrase. It's a great example.
Thank you. I would like you to talk a little bit about the Town of the Dead, because that story to me was very, very strong. I do not see the hope. I see only the fear. And to me, it's almost like introducing the Holocaust, a town that is dead, that the dead people are coming back. And it's a very strong story, in my opinion. Would you say a few words about it? Town of the Dead.
So die Teute Stott, that story you mean? Yeah, actually the thing that fascinated me in that story, just, I'm not sure it will answer your question, but early on, there's a character who says, "Wir Juden leben ohne Geographie." We Jews live without geography, which I think is a really interesting moment. And you get it elsewhere too, the obliviousness to the outside world. So I think that angle is really interesting, but I don't have a bigger reading of that story.
I mean, I agree both with you and Ken that it's a remarkable story, and I think that Ken, has identified one of the main themes of this, this sort of floated this search for identity, right? This idea that there's nothing in this changing and blurring and buzzing modern world that you can link to, right? And that's fearful, that's scary, and I think so much, like with so many of Peretz's stories, depends on how you interpret that last line, right? Which is where the guy is sitting next to the person who's telling the story and saying, "Well, are you one of these people or not?" And he says, "I'm half," right? So either that's incredibly terrifying, or maybe it's a little optimistic, or maybe it's somewhere in between, right? He's half dead, but he's half alive too. Now,
who is alive in that story?
Well, the listener. Right, the person who's the protagonist, the narrator of the story, who is hearing this and passing it on to us, and this guy, by virtue of having an audience, is become revivified in the telling of his dead story, right? And this question of can these bones live, to quote a much older person than Peretz, is the question that Peretz is fearful about and hopeful about throughout his entire career. That's one of the things we've been talking about through. So I guess that's what I would say is I don't disagree with you that it's a fearful story. It's a horror story in many ways, and we wouldn't want to say that every story of Peretz's has to be balanced between hope and fear. And this one is much closer to that side of the spectrum. But I do think that there's some possibilities of questioning the possibilities of revival, because he's, after all, only mostly dead, to quote Monty Python.
Written, and how close, in what period of his life was that story written?
If I recall correctly, and I'm not going to swear to this for the video, it's an early story. I think it's an early story, 1890s, but I'm not going to swear to that. Anyone other questions?
The issue got mentioned about the number of readers for Hebrew stories and Yiddish stories. So my impression, I'll be glad to be corrected if I'm wrong, but my impression is that from the standpoint of, with enormous contrast to modern American experience, the Jewish population was truly astonishingly multilingual in Eastern Europe. And in fact, even in the United States, we know that in the 1890s there were publications in Hebrew which had a significant readership, actually. And that was drawn from European Jewish populations. So my impression is that even though there were, of course, many people who were primarily versed in Yiddish, there were people that were primarily formally taught in Hebrew and therefore turned to Hebrew as the high cultural language. Still, the overlap was huge. And there was, in American terms, an astonishing number of people who were not only fluent in any of several other languages, but fluent, or at least could use as cultural languages, both Hebrew and Yiddish. The contrast with the modern American life, where it's hard to get young people to be on top of one Jewish cultural language, never mind two, is a painful reflection, actually. But I think that that's part of the setting against which the phenomena and the authors you're discussing, particularly Peretz, lived.
Yeah, it depends when in the 19th century we're talking about. And there's a sort of drifting away because, for example, in Berlin, there was a small elite at the end of the 18th century that was writing and reading Hebrew, but as assimilation reached Germany, there were so few readers after that that they had to close the journal after 3 decades. So, then the forefront of modern Hebrew writing moved to Galicia from 1820s to 1850, and then the same thing sort of happened with assimilation, and then the forefront moved to Russia. So it's sort of Hebrew is being beaten back in a way. Because for a while they're the yeshiva students who know Hebrew well enough to work in some kind of secular literary tradition, but then they secularize and gradually, like Utzian, the son of Peretz, who doesn't even speak Yiddish. That was the process, that they kept sort of losing Hebrew. They kept spinning off from the yeshiva Hebrew to secular literature, but then sort of the front had to move further.
Let me say, it's very striking if you go with that. If you look at where that monument is, as I have in the Warsaw Cemetery, one is very struck by the fact that there are whole regions, areas of the cemetery which are entirely in Hebrew. There are others which are virtually entirely in Yiddish, and there are others that are virtually entirely in Polish. So one can sense, despite what I said about multilingualism, one can get a sense of Kulturkampf just by walking around the cemetery, in fact, there.
What about Prague, where
Marty,
Kafka was learning both Yiddish and Hebrew? Was there a Hebraist movement in Prague where there was a big Zionist movement? There was a Yiddish theatrical movement.
Well, he became very interested in the Yiddish theater around 1911.
Yeah.
But then only at the end of his life he started to learn Hebrew. I think he moved to Berlin and sort of had that interest.
And I think that, although historically, as you're saying, sort of that happened at the end of his life, but Kafka's learning of Hebrew can serve us as a paradigm to address your question and then your question, right? Which is to say, we have these notebooks of his where he's trying to painfully sort of write all of these Hebrew words out, right, over and over again, right? To ask whether he could then read comfortably the latest work by Berdichevsky or Brenner or someone like that in a journal, it would have been impossible for him, with regret, right? But it would have been impossible for him, which meant that the number of Hebraists in a place like Prague, would have been aspirationally perhaps large, but in practice in terms of reading, much smaller than the people who wanted it. This gets one of the most interesting areas of research now in Jewish literary history, is we now have access to the subscription numbers of some of these journals, for example. And so we can see how many people actually. And the numbers are shockingly small, right? And they're small in three concentric circles. The numbers in Hebrew are small. The numbers of Yiddish journals are sometimes smaller than one would have thought, right? Because many of the people, as this explosion is taking place, people are taking Lucian's path, which is to say they're also feeling comfortable reading in Polish or Ukrainian or Russian or what have you. So if you look, for example, at the circulation records of libraries in these big towns, people are taking out books, and they're taking out books by Jewish writers sometimes, in Polish or Russian or Ukrainian. These are Jews who are taking it. So, this question of where we get to reading Jewish writers and in what languages is a fascinating question. And it's one that we're just continuing to explore more and more. And I'm sure that with all the records that are coming online from Vilna, we will learn even more. This is Jonathan does not pay me for these plugs. I'm just doing it. And I think that getting this picture and this landscape, visiting at these intervals, is just a wonderful and remarkable way to sort of get a better picture of the life.
So I would like to ask a question to the panel, which is, we know that Sholem Aleichem wrote in Yiddish largely because he wanted to communicate to his readership, that he had aspired really to be a Jewish Gogol, Jewish Chekhov. And his children spoke Yiddish, spoke Russian, and he spoke Russian. And I wonder what the case for Peretz was. Shimon Dubnov writes that the language of the Jewish people has got to be Yiddish because that's what they speak. But he also wrote in Russian for the most part. And so my question is, was Peretz writing in Yiddish and his commitment to Yiddish because the bulk of the Jewish people of Eastern Europe spoke and read Yiddish, or was it a different kind of commitment?
Well, I think maybe one way of thinking about it, there are many ways, and I'm sure everyone will say something, is that one of the reasons that people flocked to Shalom Aleichem was that he made the case for Jewish modernity, right? In other words, he took what was going on in the modern world and reflected it back. And that was a reason that he wrote in Yiddish, was he had to reach the people, and also the life that he was reflecting was taking place in Yiddish, right? It also had to do with the money, but let's put that aside for now. Peretz, on the other hand, was making the case for Jewish eternity. He was saying, the reason that you read Peretz is because he takes on everything. And he says, this is what Jewish life has been, is, and will be. And one of the remarkable, audacious things that Peretz did as a result was to make the case for Jewish eternity as not only being in Hebrew, but in Yiddish. This was, I think, the point that Marty was making, or one of the points that Marty was making. And I think that that is an incredible thing, to take the gifts of Jewish eternity and transmute them into Yiddish. This was a gift that was given not just to the Yiddish-speaking people, but to the Yiddish language as well. And that was something Peretz really is loved and cherished for.
Were they cognizant of the Jews of the East?
They meaning who, Marty? I'm sorry.
Peretz?
The Jews of the East.
The Middle East.
Oh, the Middle East.
Or Turkey, or Latino speakers.
Latino speakers. Does anyone want to speak? I would say increasingly. The period that Peretz starts writing marks, although this is really Ken's area, of Yiddish travel literature, but it's really beginning at this stage.
I could mention one thing also on the subject of spoken Hebrew, because there's a travel memoir by Nathan Sternhardt's, Nachman's scribe, from 1822, and he describes meeting Sephardic Jews and not being able to communicate, and he tries in Hebrew. So already by 1822, his Hebrew is strong enough that he can try to communicate, but the accent is so different that they can't really understand each other. I want to mention on the subject of Shalom Aleichem's language and Peretz's, Shalom Aleichem was in one of the earliest generations of Jews to go to a Russian gymnasium. So his Hebrew was not really on the level of Abramovich's or Peretz's. He had Russian. He could have become a Russian writer, and he very much coming out of a Russian literary tradition. So he didn't really have the choice of becoming a Hebrew writer in that sense.
Very interesting. Well, any more questions?
Not seven.
What was the role of Mendele in mentoring or guiding or setting standards for these men?
Definitely for Shalom Aleichem, right? Shalom Aleichem is the one who dubbed Mendele the grandfather, Del Zayda, right? And Shalom Aleichem wrote about going to visit Del Zayda in Odessa, going down from Kiev. So definitely, very much so. And people disagree about how much rivalry there was between Odessa and Warsaw. I think there was a lot.
But also a common purpose in the ultimate goal. If they could get together and join forces, which they practically never did.
That may be a great note. And one of the things that Shalom Aleichem said sort of late in life watching Peretz, he said, even though they had as Marty has pointed out and Ken pointed out, their share of disagreements, he looked at him and he said, this too is Yiddish literature, right? And that is really what we're celebrating. We're celebrating different visions for the same goal. This is all Yiddish.
And Jewish
So
literature.
I would like to end on the question, can Yiddish literature not be in Yiddish? Arnie.
Can I just ask one thing?
My father called them the Linker. My father was a Bolshevik. He went to Palestine, became a Zionist. But, I went to Sholem Aleichem. I went to Ringschule, and certainly not to Yudlamet Peretz. Why did they adopt Yudlamet Peretz? In Poland, after the war, in Warsaw, there was an incredibly successful Yiddish school, which was called the Yudlamet Peretz School. There's a documentary about it, and it only ended when Gomulka threw the Jews out. So there's some kind of affinity.
Definitely. No, Peretz was definitely allied with the workers' movement and socialists in the 1890s. And he was arrested in 1899 for speaking to striking workers. And there are stories about how his works were passed around through prison cells, and they would circle letters and use codes. And so he was definitely very much adopted by the workers' movement. Soviets did, and yes, because he was proletarian. Yes.
But they never studied Peretz in the Yiddish schools in the Soviet Union. It was far too traditional.
Too much Jewish stuff.
Too much Jewish, and neither him nor Mendel. So the lesson got adapted into the system.
Right.
If I understood...
Last question.
Okay, if I heard Professor Dauber accurately earlier, you said that Heinrich Heine was Peretz's hero, or one of his heroes?
One of his heroes, yeah.
And could you give some illustrations of why you say that?
Yeah. A number of people, for example, have suggested, these are not my ideas, that Peretz's Monish, for example, is modeled on one of Heine's poems. That a number of his other works later in life, Leah Garrett has written about this, were modeled on Heine. So I think that both people who have really done sort of a point-by-point comparison have found sort of textual leanings. But one of the things I would say is more than that, that I think that Heine, and here I rely again on one of my teachers, Ruth Weiss, Heine was someone who really demonstrated both the gifts and the costs of entering into a Western culture. And this was something that Peretz, who really loved sort of what the cultural and literary tradition of the West had to offer, and found that notion that literature was redemptive, as seductive a notion as Heine did. That was something that Peretz supped from him, and also shared Heine's own concerns and worries about. So I think both in terms of specifics and in terms of generalities, that was something that he took from Heine.
Ken, did you have something?
I just wanted to say, I think he moved away from Heine and a little bit regretted his early tendencies to Heine. The satire, because as we've been saying, he wanted to build later on and not just attack. So the early phase until in the 1890s, there was more Heine-esque satire.
And then later on, you're saying that,
he regretted it to some extent.
I think that he certainly moved away sort of from a specific thing. I think also you could say that he internalized Heine's own regrets, but maybe that's a conversation we can have offline.
Yes.
Okay, very quickly.
Depends when, though. Yeah, but I mean, isn't it Zikmanga von Czernowitz, right? Romania. It's Hungary. So what Yiddish writers came from Hungary?
Well, I think that's for another conference. Yeah. It's an excellent question. I ask it.
Jews learn physics.
Yes. Well, we hope to have a conference on the Jews and their languages, and that'll be one of them. So thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.